everyone. Okay, great. So as you just heard, we are recording, so please feel free, to request the session, post this if there's anything that you want to revisit. So my name's Alex Lamb. My pleasure to meet you. I am the founder and CEO of Boldly. We're a global coaching business. We're a marketplace, so we screen coaches, qualified coaches onto our platform, and then we help them make a match to organizations. So for companies across executive coaching, group and team coaching, early careers coaching, and careers coaching. So very much in the professional coaching space. I myself am a coach. Started my coaching career about 10 years ago with an INSEAD program, very much grounded in a psychodynamic perspective, probably very similar to many of you. Then went forward and did my ICF credentialing process, and then took on a second degree in coaching psychology through University of Sydney. So for me personally, I'm very vested in coaching standards and evidence-based practices. And so when Tom and I first connected last year, actually, we've been speaking about running this program, this session for a few months now. I was really struck by his deep knowledge, of course, but also the passion and the mission that he has around bringing those coaching standards into a profession that we all know is fledgling, still developing, and still has a lot of space for, for creating those common expectations of what good and ethical looks like. So I'm really pleased to introduce Tom to you today. But before I do that, please let me introduce my colleague, Pauline. You'll see her here as Boldly Events. My colleague, Pauline Six, is based in Belgium. She's our managing director for our European business, facing clients and working with coaches in that market. She is also chairing the session today. So if you have questions, comments, anything that you'd like to present to Tom, for his comments throughout the session, Tom will take a few moments to pause and Pauline will be able to ask those questions to him. So please shoot your questions on chat to Pauline and she'll be happy to help you. So without any other delay, please let me introduce Tom to you. Tom Krapu, who is our keynote speaker, of course, for today. He has a PhD in counselling and is a PCC designation through ICF as well. So Dr. Krapu brings over 30 years of experience and published research, very extensive representation in several journals into how we guide individuals as coaches and as organizational consultants towards transformational growth. So Tom has coached thousands of hours with hundreds of leadership clients, a very reputable background, including mid and senior level executives, company presidents, CEOs, and teams across various sectors. His international experience spans coaching, engagements in Malaysia, South Korea, Japan, Europe, and the United States. So very much has an international lens on what we'll be speaking about today, and a lot of diverse in there from technology, healthcare, government to higher education. So I think we've really got a good representation in his lens and the background that he brings here. However, his expertise extends beyond coaching as well. He has a very rich background in psychometrics, assessment, and test construction. And that's really what we're here to talk about today, is that then, that overlap between coaching and assessment and how we can use that for the greatest impact for our coachees. So Dr. Krapu's commitment to excellence is evident in his extensive contributions to the coaching community. I've personally benefited from reviewing some of his readings and the thought leadership that he puts out into the world. So I'm sure if you don't know him already, he'll be a name that you start following. He teaches executive coaching at the University of Texas Dallas Jindal School of Management and has presented research at prestigious conferences worldwide, including the ICF's annual conferences. So I know this topic of 360s is a personal passion for him. It's indeed a mission, as he's going to share with you. And I'm really looking forward to hearing his insights on this topic. I think, you are all, we've got a combination here of coaches as well as talent practitioners. From both sides of that fence, we are working extensively with 360s. And I think we all believe there's so many nuanced ways that they can be delivered very well to great effect and to great impact. But they can also, in some cases, be misused and indeed weaponized as well. So Tom's here to talk to us about best practices and the infinite possibilities for these 360s. So with that, Tom, I welcome welcome you to come to the stage, so to speak. I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Alex. Wow, what a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate that. So as we get started, I assume that most of the audience are your primary role as coach. If it's not, put your primary role in the text box. I'd like to just know if there's some HR leaders here or other roles that might have been attracted to this subject, since the subject is so relevant in organizations, not just to coaches. Really been looking forward to the presenting today. You know, assessments in general pose a challenge to coaches because, for one thing, how do you keep a coaching mindset when you're actually using assessments and not become the expert in the conversation? And so that's one challenge we have with assessments. Today, I'm going to be talking about best practices on 360 methods. And so I'm going to just start diving right in here. My presentations tend to be very content rich, and I don't know if any of you over prepare for your presentations like I do, but there's some material we might not even have time to get to today, but I want to really get to some really key high points that are help really inform our use of 360 surveys. So you know, what are 360s? That's something we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at best practices, especially those that maximize ROI for the investment that's represented in 360 methodologies. We're going to talk a little bit about personal branding, but I want this interaction today to be really highly interactive. I've based what I'm talking about on a lot of experience, understanding some of the research, which I'll be presenting today. And I feel like I'm preaching to the choir, right? If most of you are coaches, and I love talking and presenting to coaches because, you know, we're kind of a big tribe, right? But I'm really open to pushback as well. If some of the things I'm talking about don't make sense or don't make sense in your experience, that's what the chat is for, raising questions and maybe us having a deeper conversation about some of the things that I'll be talking about. So let's keep this highly interactive. I don't want to just be a talking head for the next hour. And then I'm going to be talking, there's going to be a very brief, shameless marketing thing about a 360 course I teach at the very end. So that's what we're doing today. Let's dive in. So also, why don't you say yes in the chat if you've had experience with 360s. I figure most of us probably have as coaches because it's a pretty common methodology for us. And I'd like to just maybe hear from one or two people, your name, your location, and maybe what your experience is with 360s, or more importantly, maybe what you want to get out of today. Why did you come here today? So feel free to raise your hand or come off mute, or maybe put it in the chat, although I don't want us to limit ourselves to chat because that's not very interactive. So who wants to maybe share a little bit of who you are, where you are, and what your experience has been?
I'll say something.
Thanks.
Break
Thanks,
the
Marty.
ice. Yeah. Hi. I have two practices. One is in executive recruiting, and the other is as a coach. And I've been merging coaching with recruiting for 25 years. Okay. PCC, CPA, non-active, etc. And for me, everything around recruiting revolves around relationships. And that's where the relationships and the recruiting and coaching meet. Because it's not for me to tell them who they are. It's for me to have them tell me who they are.
Yeah.
So I use 360s on rare occasion, but on occasion with senior level executives that work with this particular executive as an example to better understand their issues. Okay. Not that it would lead me to do anything, but it would give me a better breadth of understanding of what, if it's their issues, likely are some of my clients' issues as well.
Very good. Thanks, Barney. Boy, and onboarding is one of my specialties. And that sure comes into play with placement and recruitment, right? Where you're really helping people create that soft landing as they enter an organization. Thanks, Barney.
3 months of coaching, landing with everyone I place.
Wow, that's music to my ears. A lot of placement firms, they recruit and drop, right? So that's really fantastic, Barney.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to share?
My name's Maeve O'Byrne. I live in Victoria, British Columbia. I do a lot of 360s, mainly with healthcare leadership and more recently with government across Canada. And much of this is in the performance planning. The 360s are part of Chief Executive for Healthcare or Chief Executive in Government. And we work on we review the 360, and often there's a leadership development plan piece attached to it in which they use SMART goals to plan for the following year and how they want to sort of grow in those areas that they've identified and recognized. I think the one piece that I often start with a 360 is that caveat that this is a moment in time. And when we look at a 360, their actions are driven by their values, which sort of you have values, motivations, and then actions. What others see is the actions. They don't really look that deeply into the motivations and values that drive those actions. And they often put their own on top of that. So that's always a caveat that I start with, particularly with some 360s that can be quite brutal.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you, Maeve. And Maeve is describing what's a very common practice, right, in using 360s. It's to help development and giving people feedback to create that development plan. And we'll be talking a little bit about that today. That's why we're in the space as coaches and using 360s, right? Because they're that tool that can help us do that. So one of my missions in life is to end the abuse of 360 feedback in organizations. And when I teach my 360 course, I still, almost every time I teach it, hear stories of a participant in the course or someone who knows in their organization where 360s really did damage in the organization by the way it was used. Because if you think about it, 360 initiatives, either individually or if there's a 360 program, these are really organizational interventions. And I'm going to be talking about a really important thing a little bit later today about how that needs to be framed and communicated, even if it's just used developmentally, to really maximize the ROI of the initiative, whether it's individually or with a group, and then help appreciate that 360 I don't think of 360 surveys as a standalone intervention. 360 interventions are really an opportunity to create a larger feedback culture within the organization. And when it's framed correctly, it can have much broader impact than just an individual or even a group that's going through 60 feedback. And that's one of the larger returns on investment for 360s, is that if it can actually help shape the culture, then it's really adding more value beyond the individual. And then finally, a culture of safety and trust within the culture is, for me, it's almost a prerequisite. It certainly maximizes the return on investment. And if you're initiating a 360 process with an individual or a group within an organization, you really need to assess the culture that you're doing that in. Because if it's what I call a low trust, low risk culture, that's going to be a serious headwind in terms of really maximizing the benefit from 360 feedback, because 360 feedback it involves a certain amount of vulnerability, and people are less likely to be vulnerable in a low trust, low risk culture, right? So that's something that you really want to keep in mind when you're doing 360s, and you need to calibrate to that. I actually, my best practice actually is if I assess the culture of an organization and it's low trust, low risk, and there really doesn't seem like there's an environment of safety and trust within the culture, I tend to consult on doing other kind of organizational interventions, because the last thing you want to do is introduce 360 processes into an organization of low trust, potentially do damage within the culture by doing that, and also damaging the brand of 360s, because we want 360s to be a real positive, life enhancing growth kind of experience for people in cultures. And if they don't experience it that way, then it's very easy. And some of you may have experiences. I wish we had time to talk as a group about this one topic. Some of you have probably had experiences where 360s were either in a culture of low trust or they were used improperly, and they actually did more harm than good in the culture. And so one of my missions in life is to try to minimize that. And my personal preference is, if I'm working with a really low trust culture, I'll actually consult with people about doing other kind of organizational interventions that build trust and work on, building the culture before I expose 360 brand, the brand of 360s and the methodology of 360s into that culture. This next slide is preaching to the choir probably. I'm going to go through it really quick because all of you probably already know this. 360 methods involve both surveys and interviews. Some people are less familiar with the interview process, but I'm going to talk about that a little bit today. And these surveys or interviews, they provide feedback to an individual from multiple perspectives. And of course, that's why that 360 concept is there. Sometimes 360s are called multi-rater feedback. Because you're using multiple stakeholder rater groups to provide that that diversity of feedback from different directions. Typically, classically, a person gets feedback from above, like their manager, from their own level, from peers, and from direct reports. That's kind of the classic model. And then they do a self-assessment. And of course, the results compare the self-assessment to all those different dimensions. With customized 360s, you can actually customize the groups. In most 360 systems, sometimes have an other group that you can help your client design. Is there a stakeholder group that doesn't meet those classical definitions? And you can use that other group to define that. It might be a group of customers. It could be other key stakeholders that are maybe at their boss's level. Or maybe they work in a matrixed environment, and so they have a whole matrix of stakeholders that they could get feedback from. Surveys rate qualities. They're administered typically online. They haven't always been, but that's the one thing the internet has just really improved, is the ability to gather data and to be able to summarize it and automate those processes. In fact, I manage a 360 platform where we do that, publish custom surveys and deliver surveys. Interviews, on the other hand, gather qualitative data, and they're typically administered on the phone. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that after we talk about surveys, give some high points in terms of best practices in terms of that. So that's kind of an overview about what are 360s. A lot of the research, and I'll mention the source here throughout the Morganford, his research. It actually was an assembly, a research survey that resulted in an article where he gathered a lot of the different research and summarized it. And one of the things the research suggests is that ideal raters on a 360 survey have known their ratee about 1 to 3 years. That's long enough to know a person so that you're not getting first impressions. And it tends to minimize the halo effect that if you've been working with someone for 10 years, you get kind of rigidified in your feedback about someone, right? And of course, there's a lot of raters are going to fall outside of this, but the research suggests that that 1 to 3 year is where you get the most objective data. 360s are to be used for individual development, and I'm going to go in deeper depth on that in a little bit, but that's a really important component of how 360s need to be used. Because of that, they're not really indicated for performance evaluation. And I'm going to talk about that in more depth in a little bit too. Finally, aggregate data can yield group need assessment. And let me give you an example of that. And this is where you're doing a 360 initiative. That's one of the things I do in companies is help them set up a 360 program. For instance, there was a company in Silicon Valley in San Jose where we ran about 30 leaders through a 360 process over about a 18-month period. We staggered these people out in order to minimize rater fatigue, right? If you do 30 360s all at once in an organization, it really compromises the data because most of those 30 people, they're evaluating each other. So they're getting like 10 surveys to fill out. And by the time they're doing their 4th one, they're already starting to check boxes because it's like, oh my God, I don't have time to do 10 of these. So that's a best practice, by the way. If you have a large group, you want to stagger that to avoid or minimize that rater fatigue. Well, in this group, what we did was we did aggregate data after all 30 people have gone through the program. And this can be really helpful because what we want to do is, can we identify key competencies that are measured across that leadership cohort that are strengths? What, as a group, are these people really good at? And then you can give feedback to the group and do some group process around that to help build the culture around those strengths that leaders have. And then on the other end, are there certain competencies that are pretty consistently rated low among that cohort group? And you can design organizational interventions, right, to help bolster those weaknesses in the entire cohort. So now you're using individual development to really drive the development of an entire leadership cohort. So that aggregate data can really be helpful across a group that you might be doing 360s with. And then I know I'm preaching to the choir here, but coaching can yield better results. And that's one of the abuses that I'm trying to end. Even when 360 programs are used developmentally, I hear stories still all the time of a leader in an organization. We're going to give you a 360. So they administer the 360. They get a report. The report is sent to their boss. Oh my God. Okay, that's a problem right there, right? And then the boss simply hands the report to their direct report and says, here's your feedback, go do good work. And like most of you know, right, like these 360 reports are maybe 40, 50, 60 pages long, filled with data that the person looking at it, if they don't understand the nature of the data, it's just really, you know, my skin crawls thinking about it, right? And I'm sure as it does for a lot of you, because you want to do good coaching 360 debriefs, and that means being very familiar with the instrument, probably having been trained and certified in it, so that you understand the data, the nature of the data. And a part of that purpose of the debrief is to at least help the participant understand what is the nature of the data, so that as they look at the data, they're not drawing false conclusions from it. And then in the subsequent debriefing of it, you know, having an eye out for if there are misinterpretations of the data. Part of our obligation is to help them understand the data through the entire debrief process. And when you're not doing a good coaching debrief, those things just don't happen. And that's just one reason why coaching can yield better results, in addition to all the other reasons that we can think of being coaches, because we create a powerful conversation, a transformational conversation out of the data in a way that someone can't just in their own head. Couple things as you analyze 360 surveys, like you're thinking about purchasing one or buying one. Survey items should always be really specific and observable in terms of the data it's observing. that kind of takes more of the subjective bias out of ratings. If you ask someone if they're liked, that's really open to kind of a lot of interpretation and bias. But when you're actually rating specific behaviors, it helps reduce that subjective component to the feedback. And in general, the feedback tends to be more actionable as well, right? So specific and observable behaviors. In general, behaviors should be framed in terms of positive, in positive ways rather than negative ways. This way, the data itself tends to be developmental, focusing on positive behaviors and things that are potentials. Here's an important point that's often overlooked. It presents real challenges in setting up a 360 program if you're doing that, and that the culture of the organization should be aligned to what you're doing with the 360. That's a way to really maximize the return on investment of the 360, because if they're doing things within the organization, they're trying to get the culture to go in this direction, and the 360 feedback you're giving is either completely unrelated to that or maybe pointing in a completely different direction, then notice how our 360 program then is at cross purposes to what the organization is trying to do. The ideal here is to consult with the organization about their culture. What do they want their culture to be? What are they trying to create? And ideally, select a 360 that's in alignment with that, so it helps support those larger organizational development initiatives that, again, are taking place within the larger organization. You can measure a lot of different dimensions on a 360, like 10 different competencies, but dimensions shouldn't be lumped into an overall score. If you're measuring 10 leadership competencies and then you just sum across those 10, thinking you're going to get a number about how good a leader is overall, not so much. Just think about it for a minute, because a lot of different leaders are going to have a different profile in terms of which of those competencies they're good at. And you might have very good leaders with very different profiles across those competencies, because they're different strength profiles within that. So an overall lumped score kind of loses all of that, the complexity of that, the diversity of that feedback, and really becomes kind of a meaningless thing. And then finally, rater groups. You want your rater groups to be representative and anonymous. I wish we had time to discuss this, but let me just briefly talk about that. Representative means if you have a group that's called peers, then there are only peers in that group. And anonymous, and this goes to the heart of a best practice, and it's usually built into almost every 360 platform. Number one, if there's less than 2 or 3 raters in a particular group, then that subgroup, their feedback is not represented in the final report. It'll be lumped into another group. And the reason for that is if there's only 1 or 2 people who are responding, it's easier to identify who those people are, and their anonymity can't be guaranteed. So it's very important that people feel like their feedback is anonymous, especially in a low trust culture, because if people are fearing retaliation of negative feedback or just don't feel safe giving the feedback, then that's going to shape the feedback they give, and then it's going to shape and impact the data in the report and its value for the leader you're working with. So those are 2 really important things about rater groups: is representativeness and anonymity. So one of the things that Morganson really focused on in his report is that when 360 feedback, when it's used in a constructive developmental manner, it seems to maximize the individual and organizational impact in a positive direction. I wonder if I talk about that a little bit more. let me just give an example to illustrate this. Let's say you're using a 360 survey and on a leader, and the leader is told, and the raters are told, this person's promotion is going to be based on the feedback that this person gets, or this person's evaluation, performance evaluation, is going to be partly based on this feedback. That immediately creates a mindset among the raters. Wow, my boss, how he gets compensated is going to be based on the feedback I give. Now I'm really afraid to give any negative feedback because I don't want my boss to get in trouble. And in fact, I'll give a glowing review because I want my boss to think positively of me, because if I give him a good evaluation, he's probably going to give me a good evaluation. So notice how this immediately starts biasing the data that's being collected. One more element. If let's say all of my peers and I, we're all being given a 360, and it's going to determine our compensation. It really it encourages gaming the system, right? And I've seen this in organizations because leaders talk to each other. They're like, hey, I'll give you a great review if you give me a great review. Look, a lot rides on this. So notice it changes the whole dynamics of the program, and that's why it's so important to use 360 feedback in a constructive and developmental manner. One piece of research I didn't include today, but comes to mind now, is when 360s are used for evaluative performance purposes, participants focus on improving their scores, because that's what's important. I need to get a good score here because my career depends on this. If 360 surveys are used for developmental purposes, people tend to focus and change behavior instead of just trying to change their score. And that's another point that Morganson found in the research. So just think how important that these are all the things that support this position that we have as coaches, that we use 360 developmentally and for no other way. I've got a custom 360 survey that I use with physicians, and I've got some physicians using it. And just a couple of weeks ago, one of my physicians contacted me and said, Tom, I think I know the answer already, but I've got a healthcare organization who wants to use this for their physicians, but they just want to purchase the surveys, and without any guarantee that people are going to get professional debriefs or any of that. And I said, yeah, they might find someone to do that, but I'm not going to do that, because that's just so ripe for abuse and damage to the organization in terms of trust and things like that. Constructive developmental manner. If you need to make an argument with folks, I'm hoping the things I'm talking about can help you frame that argument, that help you sell 360 surveys and the abuse of it, and help really educate consumers of 360s. Here's the real value of 360s, and it's not in performance evaluation. This next point is really important. 360 feedback processes, and actually this applies to any organizational intervention, not just 360s. Participants need to have a clear understanding of the purpose of the tool and how the results will be used. And I've seen a failure in this in 360 programs that I've been involved with as a coach in different organizations. And here's one simple way it shows up. Many of you might have had this same experience. You get a new client, a new leader in an organization, and 360 is part of the program, and you meet them for the first time, and they sit down and they go, I don't know why I'm doing this. And this many times it's people who've never had a coach before. I don't know why I'm doing this. Well, what are you being told? Well, my boss told me I have to do this. So what a horrible mindset to bring to coaching, right? Is because you can hear the suspicion in their voice. They're probably even wondering, how is this data going to be used? What's happening here? And this has happened in programs that I've been involved with as a coach that were phenomenal programs that were really well designed for the development of leaders. But the problem was the communication program, the communication plan was non-existent or it didn't go down in through the organization. Because and this is when I do a 360 program, I have 360 materials that I share with all the not just the participants but the stakeholders to help create this communication. And it basically involves saying the purpose of this is individual development or leadership development, or whoa, I'm sorry, I just hit my I hit a scroller. It's developmental. It's here to help you grow as a leader. Your results are confidential. We'll be gathering data anonymously from raters. We're going to put that into a summary, non-attributable report for which you are going to be the owner. A copy of that report is not going to go to your manager or to HR. And it's purely to help you grow as a leader. And then it's not just one presentation at the beginning of the program that you say that. This has to be communicated to every stakeholder in the program that has someone going through the program. Because if a boss tells someone you're going through the program, that boss needs to communicate that same thing. Because I don't ever want a coaching client to come in for a first session saying, I don't know what I'm doing here, and I don't know what this is about, but I was told I need to be here. I don't want that ever to happen with one of my clients. So if there's one thing you take away from this presentation today, and this applies to all organizational interventions, whether it's a leadership development program or a 360 program, you've got to be really clear in that communication, have a really clear communication plan, and drive that communication through all of the relevant organization where you're doing this organizational intervention to have this impact, this larger impact in the organization, and maximize the benefit to the individuals going through the program. So can you tell I really get up on a soapbox about this topic? Yeah. Some possible uses of 360s. I mean, this is really where 360s have so many potential benefits. It opens that conversation, a candid conversation about behaviors, what their strengths are, maybe what opportunities lie there for them to become more the leader that they want to be, to have more impact, develop more followership as a leader. It can increase formal and informal feedback, because again, this 360 thing is small, is a small context in which you could be building a larger feedback culture. As a leader gets feedback through that 360, one of the conversations can be about, and maybe this is towards the end of the engagement or end of the debrief, what implications does this have to how you want to give and receive feedback in general in the organization? A lot of the research shows it can increase management learning, can increase a focus on customer service. It encourages goal setting and skill development, like Maeve had talked about. Most importantly, whatever your 360 is measuring, it's calling attention to that behavior. And that's one of the reasons that you want 360s to be aligned to the organizational culture. Because if the organizational culture wants to be developing in this direction, then you can survey the kind of behaviors that support those cultural behaviors. And you can draw attention to those behaviors, bring it front of mind. That in itself can have an impact. And through that, it can actually change culture. That's the larger opportunity in doing 360 initiatives, is actually having a shaping effect on the culture of the organization writ large. And then finally, there's research that managerial behavior and effectiveness can be improved. And of course, I don't need to convince any of you of that, because if you use 360, you've got plenty of anecdotal data where you've seen that. I see a question. How often HR do request a copy of the report? How do you address this request? So you've got to be proactive and preemptive. When you set up a 360 program, you've got to set up the guidelines for that. And HR needs to know right up front, we're doing this 360 program, and this is the conditions of doing the 360 program. The leader owns that report, And what I tell my leaders is, this is your report. You don't have to share it to anyone, but you can share any part or in whole this report with anyone you want to. But that's up to you. And the people who you're working with need to understand that before you even start the program. If you don't, you have a messy situation like that where we haven't talked about that, and now HR is saying, yeah, send me that person's report. And you're like, uh-oh. Yeah, you just don't want to be in that position. And again, I've refused to do 360 programs where the conditions weren't right. And I'll explain to the person, I help explain to the HR person all the reasons for that, right? Because we can maximize the return on investment in this by you not getting a copy. And here's why. And for the same reason that the person's manager is not going to get a copy. I hope that answers that question. Any other questions on surveys before we dive into interviews very briefly? If not, I want to talk a little bit about interviewing. Structured 360 interviews are less commonly, fewer coaches are familiar with that, but it's a really important methodology that we can use to get 360 feedback through gathering qualitative data. And the real value to 360 interviews is that they're customizable. You know, your 360 surveys, the questions are set. Usually the stakeholder groups are set. So you've got this structure that you're kind of limited to. But if you use 360 interviews, number one, you can get a feel for people's relationships in the organization, because surveys are just getting this objective or this anonymous data. But when you're doing 360 interviews, you're interviewing maybe 4 to 6 people that are in the circle of your client, and you really get a feel for the relationship with that person by interviewing people. And you also get a much clearer kind of feel for the culture by being able to actually talk to 4 to 6 different people within the organization. Interviews also can help you drill down from 360 survey results. I know if you're like me, if you do a 360 debrief, usually it answers a lot of questions, but sometimes it raises questions that aren't answered by the data, right? And if it does that, a 360 interview is really great at framing questions around the questions that are raised through this assessment process. Let's get more information or data around this. So it can help you drill down from those results. The only disadvantage to the 360 interviewing is the cost. It's pretty labor intensive. You've got to spend at least one coaching session with your client just kind of framing and constructing the survey, then probably some time offline, tweaking it and getting it finalized. You've got to interview each of the people you're interviewing. And my best practice is to keep those interviews under 30 minutes. I've seen a lot of practices where they're scheduling an hour for these interviews. And in my experience, executives in organizations don't have an hour to give to these sorts of things. That's way too much of an ask of their time. So I schedule 30-minute sessions. I don't ask more than 2 open-ended questions to gather data. And I tell them, we could easily be done in 20 minutes. And executives are more than willing usually to give 30 minutes of their time to give feedback about someone that way. So that's just another best practice I do, is to keep those interviews very concise and brief. And when you're constructing that interview, you want to look again, what is the objective I want to gain by doing these interviews? Expand on survey results, talk about what's not covered in other assessments, talk about things that's relevant to their goals or development. Let me give you a quick example. I worked with a leader, and he was offered an executive coaching engagement because he was just below the C-suite in his company, and he had a succession plan to become a C-suite member in that organization. And they said, we want to help prepare this person for that role. That's why we're doing the coaching. It's pre-onboarding. So the only people we surveyed were the C-suite executives who were familiar with him. And the questions we asked were questions like, what does this person need to develop as a leader for his next role at the C-suite in the organization? And so that's specific relevant feedback we were wanting for this person that was totally relevant to the overall goals of that engagement. And then once you've got that idea of what you want to do, then you design to that objective. I go into this in greater depth in the assessment course, but those are some of the basic best practices of doing interviews. And for those of you who are already doing interviews, I hope this helps some maybe tweak your best practices. So I want to talk a little bit about, here's another question. When you're interviewing an executive and you already have the survey report, how much do you disclose of the results when you're interviewing an executive? You don't share any of the results when you're doing a structured interview. You don't share any of the knowledge you have prior to that based on assessments of your client. It's a structured interview where you're asking, like I said, generally up to 2 open-ended questions, and you're limiting yourself. Your role is just to ask those questions and to create a qualitative database of all of the verbatim answers as best you can to those questions across a set of interviewees. So you don't share any information about what you know. You're just gathering more information on behalf of your client. And again, so I'm going to just take a second to plug my 360 course. One of the things we do in the 360 course is teach that entire structured interviewing process and the different materials and documents you need to be able to do that, and the process you go through to create a non-attributable report that then goes to your client that protects the anonymity of the people in that qualitative database. So it's a whole process you go through, and that's why it's kind of labor intensive and kind of expensive, because it'll take at least an hour or 2 to create that report. And then you're spending at least a whole nother coaching session debriefing that report. So, we're talking a lot of times at least 4 to 6 hours of your time just doing that structured interview process. But it's well worth it if you can afford that time, if your client can afford your time to spend that doing it. Hope that answers that question.
If I can qualify the question just a little bit, if you don't mind. I was thinking, if I'm the coach and I've already seen the digital report, I know the themes that I'm wanting to dig into. Am I inadvertently signaling, not intentionally, but inadvertently signaling to the interviewee what I already know I need to dig deeper on? Or have I set a sort of more generic or more vanilla question before I've seen the report? So therefore, I'm using this as an opportunity to gather more data, but it's not tailored to the themes I've already observed in the report.
Yeah, Alex. So in my experience, there's absolutely no problem in tailoring those questions to what you see in the report. And of course, you're partnering with your client to do that, right? Your client and you're designing those questions, and then those questions may have real relevance to what was in the report. But I've never had even the slightest sense that when you ask that question to a rater, they're thinking, "Oh, this must mean that." It's just a question that you're asking, like, what can this person be doing to be more effective at the next level? You ask that to a interviewee, and they're like, "Well, that's a pretty logical question. That makes sense." So there's no way to kind of, in my experience, you're not gonna tip them off about something in the report by asking a question.
Okay, I got you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question though, because if you'd be concerned about that, then that would kind of limit the kind of questions you'd want to ask. But I don't think that's never been a problem in my experience.
Yeah, no, thanks for answering. I was just thinking in light of what you were saying about communication is so key in that even the style of questions in the survey can shape and be a signal to the company. And so again, the questions in your interview are also part of that signal. Can you just qualify, are you ever surveying and then interviewing the same person, or are these two populations? Some people get the survey and some people get the interview.
It can be either. Depending on the purpose. Like if you've got a broad survey with everybody, let's say a question raises that their peers are the best people to answer this question, then you're probably just going to interview the peers. So that's the great thing about customized structured interviews is it can be whatever it needs to be. And so there could be a group of people that you're surveying, or it could be a little bit more of a diverse group that you're interviewing, like direct reports and peers or something like that. Yeah.
Got you. Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yeah, whatever it needs to be to best serve your client. And the flexibility that interviewing affords that. Wow, good. Actually, these have all been great informed questions. Let me talk just a little bit. No, we want time for question and answer. I am going to. This is the part I over prepared. I want to just talk very briefly about my assessment course. It's a 4-week course, 90 minutes per session, total of 6 hours continuing education, and it includes detailed training on structured interviews so that you have that tool under your belt and the best practices of doing it. It also involves more in-depth training on 360 surveys, so you know those best practices and how to use them. It also maybe helps you become a more informed consumer if you're looking to choose a 360 to use with your clients, to be a little bit more informed a consumer, because all these 360 programs, if you ask them, they're all the best and they all do everything and there's not any better. But of course, I'm going to say that about my 360. It might help you be a little bit more informed consumer. I use William Arruda's personal branding 360. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that, but it's a really great tool to give you feedback about your strengths, your branding strengths. And this can be really helpful in developing your coaching business. It's also a great tool for people who are doing career coaching. The course I offer doesn't certify you in William's system, but it gives you an experience with that. It might help you decide if you might want to use that as a tool within your coaching business. And so you actually get experience doing a 360, coaching someone on it, coached yourself around your results. And so the total thing just really helps you gain that confidence and competency in using 360s, both surveys and interviews, in a much more competent kind of ethical way. It's starting in March. And maybe I'll put a link in the chat box if you want to learn more about that. But let's do question and answer, because I know we wanted to allow time for that and I don't want to run over. So Alex, do you want to help facilitate questions? Or?
Absolutely happy to. So I'll open to the floor. I don't know, Pauline, if you've had any private chats, please feel free to call them out, or if anyone wants to come on verbally, let us know your questions. So I've got a question to throw in, Tom, just while the team's warming up. Benchmarks, obviously, a lot of the 360s that I've seen, or the tools that I've worked with, do have a 360 kind of a benchmark baked in. Do you have any comments just on what to look for in a benchmark, where to be skeptical, where not to, the level of data that a benchmark should have in a product before you would consider it, a useful part of that product?
Wow, Alex, that's I don't want to take the rest of our time answering that question. It's a really good question. And so here's the Cliff Notes version. Benchmarks are a way of standardizing a tool. And when you standardize a tool, not only do you get your own feedback within your survey group, you get comparative scores to that reference group, like to 3,000 leaders in North America. And it answers the question, well, how do my scores compare to those 3,000 leaders? Am I in general better, worse, or the same? It involves confidence intervals. And the proper use of those confidence intervals in debriefing standardized results is really important. And what I've found is that most coaches don't understand confidence intervals. So they're a little bit compromised in interpreting standardized data. And then one other note, customized 360s do not have a benchmark group. And a lot of times that's because you're measuring really specific tailor-made behaviors for a very unique niche group, like the 360 I have for physicians. It's questions that are more relevant to physicians than leadership in general. And we don't have benchmarks. So the downside is you don't have that comparison to 5,000 physicians, but you do have very specific data that's most relevant to physicians, not just some abstract leadership competency, but actual behavior that's related to their success. And that's the advantage of customized 360 surveys, but then you don't have a benchmark group. So that's a real Cliff Notes version of some of the elements. I could talk a whole hour just on that.
So specificity.
I have a question from a private chat. The question is about the 360 degree. Is this the tool bought, something that you buy by yourself, or that you can create or co-create with the client? Thank you.
So the structured interview you co-create with your client. It's completely customizable. In general, 360 surveys, what's the term? Off the shelf, right? It's something that's been designed, as Alex was referring to. Maybe it's standardized. It's a set of competencies. That's all that's measured. And it is not customizable. It just is what it is. And if it's measuring leadership competencies that are aligned to the culture you want to create, then wow, what a great tool to help create that culture in the organization. But it's kind of unalterable. It's a fixed survey.
And the bonus question with that, would you have some surveys to recommend?
So that's another thing I try to focus on in my assessment course. And when I teach it, we spend some time on this, and that is, I don't tend to recommend specific surveys because you want to select a survey that's aligned to your business model. So I could suggest X, like William Maruta's personal branding survey is a fantastic survey. And if you were doing career coaching, I might say, take a look at this because that's aligned to your business model. But really the best way to select a 360 survey is to really think more deeply about what is my business model? What is it I'm trying to accomplish with my clients? And let me find a tool that's aligned to that so that it helps support your business model, and it makes sense in terms of having as a part of what you offer. This is a part of your assessment package, essentially, right? And so if your business model has an assessment package, at least a 360 survey, you want to align it to whatever your business model is. Well, just a moment of shameless self-promotion again. The 360 platform that I manage, we've got a leadership 360 that measures 10 competencies in addition to some of the custom surveys I have. But again, I don't know if that survey is aligned, how well aligned that survey is to your business model. And then also, actually, cost is a factor too. You can look around to different certification programs and 360 programs, and I've seen it vary from $1,000 to $3,000 just to get certified in a tool. So that's a pretty costly upfront expense that you would have to recover in your business model to pay for that investment. So that's another reason you want to make sure you choose a tool that you're really excited about and see yourself using a lot to recoup those expenses of getting certified. Yeah.
Agreed. So I'm conscious of the time. I saw you just put the link in the course, to the course in the chat, and we'll happily share that with everybody as well. Not shameless at all. I think it's important. People have seen your credibility and they know that you've got an offering. We're all commercial. We know that's how the world works. So thanks, Tom, for sharing the link. Does anybody have final questions or anything you want to raise? Put into the discussion. No. Otherwise, I will briefly wrap up. I think my major takeaways, really appreciated this. I think thinking about that culture of trust and safety that sits around the program was one of a real key insight for me, just taking the cultural temperature before I decide if a 360 is appropriate. Really thinking about making sure that it's in a developmental framework as opposed to anything that's even vaguely communicated as performance related. And then really making sure that this 360 is measuring what we're, trying to call attention to in the skill set or in the culture or in the industry, and that it is, communicated effectively, that it's not just a program of learning and development, but that there's a real, communication groundswell as well. So much more, so many more gold nuggets, and I will definitely summarize those, but thank you, Tom.
Alex, I hope I've recruited people to my army of people to help end the abuse of 360 surveys. I'm available on LinkedIn if you want to connect. And if any of you want to just have a conversation about 360s as a result of our conversation, feel free to reach out to me, because that really is my mission. I really want 360s to be a huge positive force in the world. So thanks for being here.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. All right. Well, thank you, everybody.